I'm Connor Old, and welcome to another episode of Masters of Controlled Chaos. And today we're going to be looking at what I consider a very underrated director, a director that you probably recognize, you probably love a lot of his movies, but necessarily you don't consider him as one of the greatest directors of all time. And I want to point him out because he is a phenomenal director and should be sort of acclaimed in that sort of way. He's the director of Back to the Future, of Forrest Gump, of The Polar Express. He is none other than Robert Zemeckis. Welcome back, guys. If you're new to the series, what we do every single week is we break down a new filmmaker and talk about the central idea of what makes them great. We also look at what I consider their best movie, my favorite movie of theirs, and then an underrated one of them. Sometimes they match up, sometimes they don't. All depends on the director. And today we're looking at Robert Zemeckis. He's a very interesting director. I said underrated at the top of the show because I think that, we think of great directors like Spielberg and, even Kubrick and Hitchcock, and all these guys are super influential. But then we don't necessarily consider Robert Zemeckis one. I think, especially as just a casual fan of movies, if you have some people that just love movies, I'm a big fan of movies, but if you have someone in your family that just likes movies, most people do like movies, they're gonna like a lot of Robert Zemeckis' movies. Like I said at the top of the film, Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, these are classic pulp culture icons. Sort of in the film community, people look down on Forrest Gump because it beat out Pulp Fiction and Shawshank Redemption for the best Oscar that year. But that being said, it's still a fantastic movie, and I still think that people sort of in the film community I know, especially the hardcore, they sort of turn their nose at Zemeckis because it's like, oh yeah, he's pretty good at making like kids movies like Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and he's sort of tailored off after that. But I actually want to make a point in this episode to sort of mention that he hasn't fallen off. I think he was in his prime for sure with, I'd say, Romancing the Stone, and then Back to the Future, and then the Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and the previous sequels, all the way up until, I'd say, Forrest Gump, or you can even extend that, all the way to Polar Express, because then you have Castaway after that, and then Polar Express. That was his prime. But that doesn't mean he still doesn't make great movies now. I just recently watched Allied. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but I definitely appreciated the craft of something like Flight is a great movie, I just think that he's still got this sense of him too. I know some people sort of relate him to like a Rob Reiner, who we will be covering soon. Actually, I might do him next episode. We'll see. But they can sort of consider him as a Rob Reiner because he fell off. But Rob Reiner really fell off. He's like totally out of the water now. But Robert Zemeckis is still making great movies. Allied is still, I'd say, generally entertaining movie for the most part. Flight is a really great movie. The Walk is an entertaining movie. So these sort of recent movies that he's done, I think people have sort of written them off because he's done. It's a Robert Zemeckis movie, but he's done. But he's still making good. Allied was a $100 million film. They still trust him in making these big hits, and he's still got that charm. And I just think that he's sort of underrated in that sense, even though he's made some of these amazing sort of classic movies that we consider. I consider Forrest Gump a classic. I consider Back to the Future a classic, just because of how it sort of impacted pulp culture. And now let's go into what makes him great. I think what distinguishes what makes Robert Zemeckis different, his sort of style in a sense, is he doesn't have a very striking visual style necessarily that would say, oh, this is sort of a Zemeckis movie, but it's not until you sort of get throughout the movie that you feel like, oh, this is maybe like a Zemeckis movie. Why? Because of emotion. I think throughout all of his movies, emotion is a super key element. He doesn't necessarily, Back to the Future, for example, is a great story and it's very complex, but he doesn't necessarily go right into the thriller genre. That's why I was a little surprised with the Allied pick, but I think he's really great at taking someone like a screenplay that's a thriller, very complicated, and really adding the emotional layer to it. If you have a perfect screenplay like Bob Gale, it has all the great, callbacks and stuff like that, but it's up to Zemeckis to really create that emotion. And I think throughout his movies, he's able to do that. Sometimes even in some of the more scientific movies like Contact, it's not like, oh, maybe you can nitpick some of the science, but I think the emotion is there. And just by that, I just mean, the characters are believable. You want to care for their characters' sake. He really develops them first, over the story, over even dialogue, stuff like that. He wants you to really care for the characters. Look, Tom Hanks in Castaway. In Castaway, Robert Zemeckis made you care for volleyball. In Who Framed Roger Rabbit, he made you care for a cartoon, right? He's always trying to manipulate perspectives to think, okay, maybe you're on this side, but then maybe you're not, especially in something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I was on the human side, then I went to the toon side, and I was a little bit back and forth. But just creating the emotion for these characters and really creating these three-dimensional characters and giving to on screen and giving the right on-screen directions to the actors so that they can give those performances, but also sort of manipulating the movie to create that emotion. I know a lot of people sort of consider manipulation like a bad word in that sense, but I think he manipulates our emotions in a good time using some things like Alan Silvestri's score in like Castaway, for example. It's a scoreless movie up until slight spoilers for Castaway. He gets off the island, and then we hear the sort of score that comes into it. So just really interesting points like that. He uses the score really well with Alan Silvestri, a common sort of collaborator. He's worked on every single one of his movies, I believe, or for the most part, every single one of his movies. But really just creating that emotion. I think he's able to create emotion, make you care for characters, and really tug at your heartstrings more than any other character before. And I think some of his best movies are when the screenplay of like Forrest Gump or like Back to the Future or Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where the screenplays just really hold up. And he does write some of his screenplays, but for the most part, there's often a few scenarios where he's never the sole screenwriter, but he always helps contribute. But then there's some scenarios where he doesn't contribute at all. He's just the director. So it's really interesting like that. He's very much a director's director, but you can still feel his imprint on there, especially because he chooses these stories with incredible emotion. And just like I said, I think that's something that he brings, and I don't think a lot of directors necessarily can get that. Someone like Michael Mann I talked about last week is more about the interesting stories and the characters that are deep, but then relies on performers to really get into them. But Zemeckis allows the performers to get into them and then really focuses on that performance and on the character's sort of viewpoint. And I really appreciate that, and definitely you'll get an emotional ride through a lot of his movies. These emotional stakes are higher than anything else, and I think that makes them really unique and something that not a lot of people pointed out. Another thing I want to point out is his use of machinery. This is something sort of obvious in a lot of his movies, but he actually likes vehicles, using vehicles as a vehicle to tell the story and tell sort of symbolization and metaphors. Things like cars, thing about just classic vehicles in his movies. DeLorean in Back to the Future, the streetcars in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the planes in both Castaway and Flight. I mean, the Polar Express and Polar Express. I just think that he's using these sort of vehicles in an interesting thing where he uses them to tell the story, and they're actually a central part of the story in that sense. I mean, at the end of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the master plan is to, it's not a spoiler, but it's to build a freeway. It's like, what? So it's always an interesting thing where he's trying to show like American life through the machinery and sort of how technology is developed. And that's actually an interesting point to segue over into technology. Robert Zemeckis loves technology. He loves CGI and just experimenting with whatever the newest thing is. Something like Death Becomes Her, the interesting technology, which it's not a good movie, but he sees like the giant hole that you can see, the Polar Express. He sort of has a CGI motion capture trilogy in Polar Express, Beowulf, and A Christmas Carol, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but when they do work, they hit, in my opinion. And I just think that he's always trying to get the next best thing, in The Walk, whatever, the incredible IMAX cameras that he used to create that sense of sort of feeling. And there's not the World Trade Centers anymore, unfortunately, the Twin Towers, right? So he couldn't use those as a setting, so you have to do interesting creative things. Even look at something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the very first movie, and really one of the only ones I think ever, and has done it, and nothing could ever top it ever, I don't think, is the creation of animation and of humans and live action. And I think it still holds up today. It totally works, like how they interact. It's so interesting. I don't know the behind the scenes of it, and I gotta check it out, but just how the animated characters interact with the human characters, and it looks so real and it feels real, and just to be able to create that incredible sort of innovative technology, he does a great job at it. Robert Zemeckis is also a sort of student of Steven Spielberg, a disciple, we'll say, just because he's able to create that Amblin. If you don't know Amblin, that's sort of Steven Spielberg's sort of company, or like DreamWorks, Amblin, sort of that sort of stuff, where I use the term Amblin, and people have used this term before, in terms of just creating like a fun, family-filled adventure. I think he does a great job at that. Steven Spielberg, something like E.T. or Raiders of the Lost Ark, these just fun, sort of frolicking adventures, and Zemeckis can very much do that with, say, Back to the Future would be like the E.T., and even later on, Zemeckis gets a little more serious, like Contact. That could be something like Schindler's List or something like that. And then even Romancing the Stone, great movie, is similar to like Raiders of the Lost Ark. So he's definitely in that sort of same style as Spielberg, where he can tug at your heartstrings. He's very much into emotion. I think Spielberg is overall a better director, but still, Zemeckis is totally like, if we were doing one-to-one, like I think Back to the Future is better than E.T. Romancing the Stone, Indiana Jones, I give it to Indiana Jones, but Romancing the Stone is still a fun time. The way E.T. is so close to Back to the Future, they're very much similar in that sense. And he's never really done animation in the traditional sense, but I really think that he's able to do that pretty well, in like the things I pointed out, in just the technology. It's not necessarily like interesting sort of practical effects, it's a lot of animation, sort of computer effects is what he's really focused on. Yeah, just one thing I want to point out is an interesting thing that I found when rewatching a lot of his movies recently and watching some of his movies for the first time. It's a strong sense of faith. I'm not sure if Robert Zemeckis is a religious man necessarily, but he definitely has that sense of faith in terms of, you look at something like Contact, it's like faith that the aliens exist. That's the search of the aliens. Hopefully they do exist. Polar Express, faith that Christmas and Santa Claus exist. Castaway, faith that he can get off the island. Allied, faith that your wife isn't a German spy. There's all these interesting faith-based aspects, and it's not necessarily in a religious sense, like religious imagery and all this crazy stuff, but it's just the central topic of faith that I'm not sure if that's because he's a religious guy, but he definitely talks about sort of the hope and the dreamers and the faith, and I think that's definitely very personal to him, and you can see that personal aspect come out in a lot of his movies, I think. Something like Back to the Future is very much an old Hollywood style movie, but then something like Contact is a very personal movie. And even something like Flight, it's like it didn't happen to the guy, but I feel like it's a personal movie. And like I said, tapping into that emotion of the characters and making you feel. Just a great manipulator and master, really, of emotion, if I would give him a name. So anyways, let's go over what I consider his best movie, Back to the Future. And how can you not choose Back to the Future? It's a classic movie in my eyes, one of the greatest movies of all time. I consider that, maybe in a top 10. It is so impeccably crafted. I would consider this actually one of the few perfect movies of all time. I would not change one thing about it, and I think it's great for all ages. This is not something where I saw this as a kid and I'm a big fan of it, and oh my god, it's so great. I actually saw this a couple of years ago when I was 16 years old, so I did not have that sort of childlike aspect to it, but when I did watch it, oh man, did I love it. I was so totally transported into that, and I'm not saying it necessarily in an immersive way. I don't think the movie is very immersive at all. It definitely feels like, and maybe this is sort of like prior knowledge of it, it feels like it's on the Universal or wherever it was, studio backlot. I felt like this was a stage that they built in sort of a world, but I didn't care, because I felt like it had that great sense of movie making and that innocence that it has. It felt like a movie, and it feels like movies how they're supposed to be and how enjoyable they are and how they're able to create a great story. And it's not immersing you in this world and you try to feel like you're there, like in so many war movies or something like that. But it definitely makes it feel like just a good sort of fun, frolicking time. And I know that sort of looks down upon the absolute amazing craft that goes into it. But I definitely think that movies aren't necessarily made like that today. It has that sort of old Hollywood sort of vibe to it, and it feels like that sense. And I consider why a lot of people consider this their favorite movie of all time. And I know a lot of people that go into filmmaking consider this an amazing movie, and they love it, because I watch this movie and I'm like, man, I can do it. It's almost like inspirational I think for a lot of people, in an interesting way, inspirational to make movies. They're like, oh, I can tell this great story and beginning, middle, and end, and everything's happy and everyone loves it, and I can create this awesome set that I can shoot at. And it's like, this wasn't necessarily a location movie. They built all this stuff, and you can sort of feel that into it. And I think a lot of times people consider like just the Back to the Future-esque. They consider that to, like I said before, in the Amblin style of the Spielberg school, of that sort of innocence of something like an E.T., sort of the family film, family films or whatever, but this has a lot of innocence. I think nowadays a lot of movies that are good for the kid and good for the parents are animated movies, specifically Pixar movies. They're an incredible job at doing that. But I don't think there's a lot of live action today that's great for the kids and great for the adults. Most live action is for adults and not a lot of kids that really enjoy that. You could say maybe superhero movies, but even still, it's not like this sort of universal love. I know a lot of parents don't like superhero movies, right? That's sort of a kid thing, and I like superhero movies, right? But not necessarily these older people. But I think Back to the Future is a super interesting movie in that sense, because it's not really made today. That innocence, that sense of wonder that Spielberg, and really, well, I say Spielberg because it seems like a Spielberg movie. I think John Williams scored the score, but it's definitely sort of the alter ego, Spielberg will say, Robert Zemeckis, and alter ego of John Williams, Alan Silvestri, with an incredible score. And that's not to undermine them in any way, just it feels so great, like this sort of classic movies that you sort of consider. And I think some people might even consider Spielberg did Back to the Future too, because he's done so many of these great sort of 80s fun, even to 90s, like Jurassic Park family movies that are great, and that we don't really see anymore. Unfortunately, aside from like a Spielberg or even Zemeckis, but even Zemeckis is sort of strayed away from that. And really, let's talk about a little bit about the storytelling. There's a master class in storytelling. Classes and film schools are taught about Back to the Future. Like entire classes are dedicated to this movie because of its incredible 3-act structure and how it sort of creates two timelines, where it has the 1985 and then the 1955, and then going back and then eventually coming back to 85. You know, there's having to have the setup, so then there's a payoff, so then there's a resolution. It is beat by beat, so incredible. Like that's why I consider this a perfect movie, because things like the opening shot where we see the clocks and then we see a guy hanging off a clock, you know, that's obviously a reference of The Last Safety, an old 1920s movie, but also for rewatchers, that's what happens to Doc in the clock scene. He hangs off it too, so it's like telling you a little bit about it in that sort of opening great one take, and then just the setup of just you know, just the setup of, you know, Marty's dad gets bullied by, oh my God, I'm forgetting his name, Biff. He gets bullied by Biff, and then he goes back to high school, and it's the same sort of scenarios, and just to show what all your parents always say, you know, something like, oh, it's, people will never change, right? You know, we see this in this movie where 1985 is very similar to 1955. You know, the world has changed, and it's sort of like this different world, and people are doing different things. There's different cars, but the people are all the same. And we see that with the principal, you know, talking down to George McFly, and then does the same thing with Marty McFly, and just small things like Marty and his girlfriend are about to kiss, and then someone shakes a can of coins that say like, hey, slave to the clock tower, and then he has to go back and realize that, oh, this is the clock tower's significance in 1955, and little things like that. And then we see throughout the rest of the trilogy, which I actually like Back to the Futures 2 and 3. I think they're a great sort of feeling, and I think he's able to create that emotion and sort of sense of adventure and wonder and imagination that is so hard to capture, but he does this in an impeccable movie. This is a movie I'd recommend to absolutely anybody. It's pitch perfect. It's so hard for me not to pick this as my perfect. I almost picked this as my favorite. You know, this is very close to me as my favorite because I really love it just as a classic family film with also the fish out of water sort of tendency, and really, just if you think about it, everything is iconic, right? You have the characters, Marty McFly, Doc Brown, the DeLorean. Every time you see a DeLorean, people think of Back to the Future and time travel, and just this incredible sort of score that's iconic. Everything's iconic. It's definitely a cultural landmark film, and rightfully so, because it is a fantastic, amazing movie that I don't think was appreciated necessarily at the time, but definitely as people come back, they're like, yeah, this is just a top-notch, just incredible movie that is so endlessly rewatchable. I could see this movie so many times. It's just such a fun time. And just, if you haven't seen Back to the Future, I mean, it could be sort of like maybe your dad likes the movie and you're like, oh, I don't like that, whatever, but please watch the movie. It's an incredible movie, and it's so what can you say about it that hasn't been already said? It's such an amazing time, such a fun time. What a great movie in that sort of movie sense. And that's why I consider it his best. And moving over into what I consider my favorite movie and an underrated movie of his, that would be, boom, The Polar Express. You know, I say this as underrated, just get that out of the way, because I think a lot of people like this movie, but when I look at the critics and when it was released at the time, a lot of people did not like it. It's got a terrible sort of score. I know some of the people that aren't necessarily younger sort of look back and be like, oh, Zemeckis, and when he was doing the weird CGI stuff. But I think a lot of people my age and in my generation really love The Polar Express. Every time at Christmas, they still show The Polar Express at my local movie theater, because as like sort of a classic thing, they show that and Home Alone and A Christmas Story, like part of the seminal sort of classic Christmas movies that everyone likes, and something like It's a Wonderful Life. Even though it's not a Christmas movie, it's like the seminal Christmas movies in that sense, they still show it with Polar Express, because they consider it a seminal Christmas classic. It's a modern day classic for Christmas for sure. And growing up at that time, it was 2004, so I was a pretty young kid at the time, and just to see that, and just I have incredible amount of nostalgia for that, because I love the movie when it happened. It's just so synonymous with me and Christmas that I couldn't separate it. I have like 5 Christmas movies on my top 100 list of all time. Let me know if you want me to release that, but I can't. It's always changing. But I always have like 5 Christmas movies on that list. So I'm a big fan of the Christmas genre. Home Alone 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time. Seriously, like I love that movie, and really Polar Express is up there too, because I think that Zemeckis, as a great master of emotion, and then putting him into a Christmas movie that is already built with so much emotion and so much great times for a lot of people, as you know, it's the best holiday in my opinion, and I think a lot of people do have that sort of sense because it is so happy, such a joyous time, so many great memories. But then to create those, to get the master of emotion, Robert Zemeckis, and put him in a Christmas story, you created an amazing story with so much emotion that's synonymous with Christmas. And for me, more than any other Christmas movie, other than Home Alone 2 and Elf, those are some great. I love those Christmas movies, but they're unlike this in the sense of creating what the childlike joy is. Me being a little older now, saying that, just like when you're 5 and you're 6 and you're 7, you really love Christmas and you're so excited to it. I still love Christmas. I still have that joy, but making me feel like a 5 and 7-year-old, there's an overwhelming sense of joy and emotion during Christmas Eve. That amount of sense of wonder I feel in this movie, in the Polar Express. I feel that sense that I did when I was a kid. And I think it does an incredible job at that, because maybe that's a nostalgia thing, maybe it's not, but I think I watched it again, I'm like, this is just a top to bottom solid great movie. Some of the animation is sort of like weird, and some people can't connect to the sort of weird figures like that, but I think the emotion sort of overrides that. The characters really built like that. It could have been a live action movie, but I think it would have lost some of that, and sort of the wonder and imagination, sort of distant from reality, but then sort of similar to reality, because you take this character in, I think he's just called the boy, and you take him on this journey that's so wonderful and magical, but so you have that realistic aspect, like you're that guy, and you're the guy that doesn't want to go on the train because his parents didn't tell you to do it, but then you're so excited for Christmas that you want to do it, so you feel like that sort of relatability in the boy character. But then you also see the wonder in Santa Claus, and the North Pole, and the adventure of the Polar Express, and there are stakes in the movie. There's incredible amounts of tension and sort of pits in your stomach, like, oh my God, and sadness, and then joy, and it's just an emotional roller coaster, emotional ride on the Polar Express. The Polar Express itself is an incredible character. Tom Hanks does an amazing job at playing all these different characters. He played like 4 or 5 in the movie, and he does an awesome job at each, and especially in the train conductor, my favorite part, where he gives sort of the strict, sort of teacher-like role, where he's strict and he tells you what to do, but you could tell that he really loves you and loves his thing and loves the children coming in here, and he really loves his job in a sense. I felt sort of a teacher role like that, and just like I just feel like this incredible amount of emotion that radiates off the screen, and I feel it, and that Christmas magic is throughout Polar Express. And I say underrated just because so many people didn't like this movie critically, but I think as a generational movie, a lot of people consider this like, oh my God, this is a classic. I love Polar Express. Everyone my age, my generation, I think really loves the Polar Express, and I think will be one that'll be looked on fondly throughout the future. And I think it still is sort of looking back fondly. Actually, in this interview right here, he's on NBC News, right? A big sort of daytime television thing that people watch. And what did the guy introduce him as? He says, the director of Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, and Polar Express. He didn't say Who Framed Roger Rabbit or Romancing the Stone or Contact or Castaway. Maybe you could say Castaway. Castaway was sort of a culturally relevant one. But Polar Express, because I think that sort of hit our culture really well, and I think the incredible IMAX technology that released in, and just I think that it definitely works, and I think people are going to have revisionist history on that, because it wasn't like that at the time, but it's starting to be looked back to like, this is a Christmas classic, and even still some Christmas classics aren't rated at 99%. I understand that, but the amount of emotion that it creates, it's not just pure joy like Christmas. It does a great job at the tension and the stakes that it brings, because it allows the emotion and the joyousness to just be even that better, because you have the downfalls and the pits. And I just really love this movie, and I definitely recommend you watch it, especially around Christmas time. It gives you just like this incredible amount of sense of, I love Christmas movies, just that sense like a warm blanket around you. That's the only thing I can express. But anyways, guys, for all those reasons, that's why Robert Zemeckis is a master of controlled chaos. If you like the video, make sure you like the video, comment below, let me know what your favorite Robert Zemeckis movie is. I'd love to hear it. Next week, I'm not sure what we're going to be doing. We might be doing Billy Wilder or Rob Reiner. Check out for that. That should be fun, because I'm actually going to see Some Like It Hot for the very first time in theaters, so that should be a lot of fun. That's it, guys. I'm Connor Old, and until next time, stay tuned.